everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Today we'll read Chapter 5 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. Chapter 5 is called Problems in Paris. Ooh la la! Here we go. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and sometimes not. A photo might say almost nothing or convey an image that isn't quite consistent with what is really happening before and after the shutter clicks. Consider a photo taken at the base of the Eiffel Tower shortly after Van Halen had arrived in Paris for the very first time in May 1978. 2 months of touring in the States had been followed by a short break and then a handful of concerts in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Then it was off to Paris for a one-night stand at Le Theatre Mogador, which would be followed by several days of vacation in the most beautiful city in the world, and then a 4-week tour of the UK. The 4 young men in the picture appear to be quite happy. They are rock stars who still don't quite realize that they are rock stars, and so there's an innocence about them that is genuinely charming. They've never been to Paris, never seen the Eiffel Tower. Life is good, the photo seems to say. Life is exciting and filled with possibility, and it's only going to get better. The previous week had been a whirlwind of traveling and performing, of behaving like a tourist one moment and a native son returning home in the next. We had played the famous Paradiso in Amsterdam on May 6th, a gig that was unique not only because patrons were allowed to purchase weed and hash from a concession stand, like soda or beer in the United States, but because it was the first time that Edward and Alex Van Halen had performed in their native country. Naturally, Van Halen had quickly become enormously popular in the Netherlands, and the brothers were treated like hometown heroes every time we visited. The band's records reached gold and platinum status in that part of the world faster than almost anywhere else. In the dressing room after the show, there was quite a large contingent of Van Halen relatives, but I noticed that they weren't exactly the closest of families. The Dutch relatives of their father Jan stayed on one side of the tiny room, while Eugenia's Indonesian relatives remained on the other. The tension was palpable, but did not seem to surprise Edward or Alex, who had long since grown accustomed to such familial strife. In general, they both seemed thrilled to be back in their homeland and to be experiencing it as adults. I remember walking with the brothers through Amsterdam's red light district on our day off and seeing them marvel at the openness of the Dutch culture. There were coffee houses in which hash brownies were served alongside espresso, and brothels in which people in varying stages of undress wriggled and writhed in the windows. And it was not only legal, but accepted. Alex and Edward walked through the neighborhood slack-jawed and bug-eyed, as you would expect of a pair of red-blooded American males who had never been outside the country. You could almost read their minds. Man, why did we ever leave this place? I got a huge kick out of seeing how the guys responded to international travel. Not just Edward and Alex, but the entire band and even the crew members. When I was 21 years old, I spent 3 months hitchhiking alone through Europe. It was, to say the least, an enlightening experience, and one that proved foundational for my entire life. By the time I joined Van Halen, I had lived in Denmark, Paris, and Tangier, among other places. I was an American and always would be, but I understood that the earth was a large and eclectic place, and that not everyone considered Americans God's gift to the world. It's good to get out once in a while and realize that a vast portion of the world's population does not speak English and, frankly, has no interest in learning it. In general, the boys of Van Halen embrace being exposed to new experiences and cultures with enthusiasm and a sort of wide-eyed innocence. Certainly, Le Theatre Mogador fell into this category. Built during World War I, it is generally considered one of France's most beautiful venues, elegant and dripping with history, inside and out. Mogador is a smallish space, seating roughly 1,600 patrons, but every seat has a perfect view and the acoustics are extraordinary. Suffice it to say, Van Halen had not yet performed in a venue that carried the weight and tradition, not to mention the elegance of Le Theatre Mogador. The Paradiso in Amsterdam was extraordinary for different reasons. But these guys were nothing if not audacious. All those years of playing live practically for free in front of inebriated, screaming fans, either in backyards or steamy clubs, had made the band not just incredibly tight and efficient, but utterly fearless. You could throw Van Halen into almost any venue, in front of any crowd, and they would simply do their thing, and they would do it about as well as any rock band had ever done it. So, they weren't intimidated by Le Titre Mogador or by the prospect of playing in front of French fans for the very first time. On some level, it was just another night and another gig. When we first arrived in Paris, I met Jacques, the head of Warner Electra Atlantic's Paris division. Jacques and his entire staff were true professionals, committed to making our trip to Paris a successful and enjoyable one. The same was true of the promoter, the renowned Albert Koski, who was sort of the Bill Graham of Paris. Over breakfast on the morning of the show, Jacques and I swapped stories and gossip about everything that was happening back at Warner corporate headquarters in Burbank, as well as in the music world at large. Jacques was a smart man, and I enjoyed his company. Much as I liked hanging out with my band, it was nice once in a while to experience some adult conversation. Jacques told me all about the great plans he and his staff had put together for our trip to Paris, the show, as well as the 3 days afterward, when we would have time to take what amounted to a vacation. Every detail seemed to have been considered. Expensive hotel, a pair of limos with drivers at our disposal for the duration, guided tours, whatever we wanted or needed. Given our relative youth and inexperience, they were really rolling out the red carpet. Sure, Van Halen had created a fair amount of buzz by this time, but we weren't exactly the Rolling Stones. Nevertheless, that's the way we felt. Back at the hotel, I went over the itinerary with the band. There would be several interviews with various media outlets in the ensuing days, both before and after the show. This, as always, elicited groans of displeasure from the guys. No surprise. It is imprinted in the DNA of virtually every rock star that they have a visceral reaction to the idea of promotion, and especially interacting with the press. David and Alex were the most pliable in this regard. In the beginning, they did probably 90% of the interviews. As time went on, David took on an even greater role, which was fine, since he had an uncanny ability to turn on the charm for anyone with a camera or a microphone, and to turn it off the moment he re-engaged with those closest to him. The show was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock. I had presumed that was for the opening act, and that we would go on around 9 or 9:30. By 3 o'clock, we were at the theater for our sound check. Although tired and hungover, the boys were impressed by the physical beauty of the venue and excited about playing that night. As always, David took charge, barking instructions to the sound man and complaining about almost everything. What the... Man, the echo is not coming in on the right beat. Can you fix it, please? As smooth and cordial as David could be in guiding the course of an interview, he was often exactly the opposite in dealing with technicians and support staff, and even his bandmates. He was fussy and very easily annoyed, and had little use for diplomacy. His observations, however, often proved to be right, as in this instance. The sound man had indeed upped the echo effect, and it was ruining the song. While the band continued its sound check, I ran out for a quick bite to eat. When I returned, I was surprised to see that Marshall Burwa had arrived. Ordinarily, this would not be a strange occurrence. A band's personal manager should be a fixture on the road after all. Because Marshall had been a veritable ghost on the tour, I had no idea that he was planning on joining us in Paris. We shook hands and chatted. By this point, I neither liked nor respected Marshall. His absence on the tour spoke volumes to me about his involvement with the band, but I tried to wear my contempt on my sleeve. As for how he felt about me, I don't really know. I presume he was at least savvy enough to know that I had the full support of Carl Scott, and that my time with the Sex Pistols had only enhanced my reputation as a savage road dog. When Albert Koski walked by, I introduced him to Marshall, and the three of us chatted briefly. During a lull in the conversation, I asked Albert about the opening act. A look of confusion came over his face as he turned to one of his assistants. The assistant shrugged. No, Albert said. I don't think we have an opening act. This didn't seem possible. Surely they didn't expect a new band, one that had never been a headliner before, to suddenly show up in Paris and fill the theater on its own, right? I turned to Marshall. As manager, he should have had an idea what was going on. Indeed, he should have been deeply involved in putting together the dates and the venues and supporting acts. "What's the story, Marshall?" I asked. Marshall shook his head coolly. "I have no idea. I just got here." Typical. Marshall proceeded to deal with the situation the way he did most problems. He told me curtly, "Do whatever you want, Noel. You're the road manager," and proceeded to get the hell out of Dodge. Now I had a great deal of fondness and respect for Albert, but I felt that he had put me in a very difficult position. I reminded him that Van Halen only had one album, and that we had been out on the road for 2 months promoting that album, playing essentially the same buzzsaw of a set night after night, roughly 40 minutes of balls-to-the-wall rock and roll. We were good, but we were not yet a headliner, and didn't have near enough material to pretend we were, especially not on such short notice. "Oh, merde!" Albert exclaimed. I nodded. "Yeah, I feel the same way." But it was my problem now. I had nothing to do with setting up this tour or this particular date. Nevertheless, as tour manager, it fell on my shoulders to inform the band of this situation and to assuage whatever concerns they might have. They responded with a mixture of bewilderment and anger. At first it was pretty obvious they thought I was joking, but when reality set in, they got pissed. "Fix it," David said. "I don't care what you have to do. Just make it right." "There is no fixing it," I said. "You guys are going to play tonight, and you're going to be the entire show. So let's figure out how to give these people their money's worth." The answer was simple. We'd play a longer set, utilizing covers that had been part of the band's repertoire on and off for years, with a sprinkling of rough, unrecorded original material to pad it out. We had already decided that the regular set would end with "You Really Got Me," since it was a well-known hit by both us and its composers, the Kinks. Even though it wasn't ours, at the time it was our signature and most easily recognized song. They'd play the out of it, same as always, and then get off the stage. Easy-ish. Ordinarily, as a non-headliner, that would be the end of the night. But now, if all went well, we would wait in the wings as the crowd cheered for more. If the guys had done their job, an encore would be expected and appreciated. I reminded them, too, what was at stake. That it was not only their first show in France and a warm-up for the 4-week UK tour, but also a performance in front of several WEA brass. Far from being apprehensive about this scenario, the band was excited. They viewed it as a challenge. I noticed David looking at Edward, who then looked at Alex. Michael stood off to the side, almost on his own. But after a few pensive moments, they all began to smile, and I knew everything would be okay. A few hours later, Rudy took the mic. "Is Paris ready to rock and roll?" he screamed, using his best French accent to say the name of the city, Paris. "Let's hear it for Van Halen." They were, and Van Halen was ready for Paris. The boys took the stage with a confidence that bordered on cockiness. David strutting and laughing, and Edward carrying his guitar with the swagger of a true impresario as they launched into a blisteringly authoritative version of On Fire. Given the historic setting, the pressure of carrying an entire evening on their own, and the unpredictability of playing before a French audience for the first time, it certainly would have been understandable for the band to be intimidated, or at least anxious. But they weren't, not in the least. Playing balls out from the opening chords, the band performed a slightly elongated set that lasted a little more than 45 minutes, ending with a gloriously rough and tumble version of "You Really Got Me," exactly as planned. Then came the first encore, DOA, a sample that didn't make it on the first record, but would be part of the band's second release, followed by Eddie Cochran's classic Rave Up Summertime Blues, and a scorching instrumental outro from Black Sabbath's Symptom of the Universe, and finally Bottoms Up, another track that would end up on Van Halen 2. After more than 59 minutes of ferocious playing, Eddie hit the last chord and David yelled, "Thank you, Paris! We love you all!" The audience reciprocated with thunderous applause. Standing in the wings, taking it all in, I felt almost like a teenager attending his first rock show. The cynicism and tedium that so often accompanied my job melted away as I watched these 4 kids from California gather at the edge of the stage and wave to the audience before walking off triumphantly. On display was the transformative power of rock and roll in all its youthful glory. A crisis had not merely been averted, it had been transformed into a huge victory. On this night, it felt like anything was possible. Van Halen was invincible. For the next couple days, we made good use of the luxury transportation that had been provided and did our best to soak up the nightlife of Paris. I shared a car with David and Peter on our first free night. Our driver, Dudu, was reportedly among the most knowledgeable guides in the city, and he certainly lived up to this reputation, squiring us to an assortment of wholesome and traditional Parisian sights during the day, and then to some of the less traditional parts of town after the sun dipped below the horizon. The wine was superb and the women were beautiful, and at only 100 francs, a relative bargain. David and I walked the streets together, talking of record sales and grand schemes to raise our profile in the press and with radio stations. It was on such occasions, away from the arena, recording studio, or the Warner offices, that I felt closest to David. Sure, we were discussing business, but in a casual and comfortable environment, in a way that felt relaxed and natural, even friendly. That night I certainly didn't mind being in his company, and I'll admit that even when he would suddenly cut off the conversation and introduce himself to one of the beautiful working women who passed by, he could be downright charming. In the morning we shared stories with the rest of the band and crew. They had wound up in a slightly rougher section of town, near a park where the hardcore street girls plied their trade. Deals were made, cash exchanged, and acts performed quickly and without elegance. Which would have been fine except for the fact that Alex's roadie Greg apparently had said something inappropriate to one of the girls. Alex related the story. The worker pulled a knife and attempted to slash Greg in his backside as he leaped through the rear window of their limo. The car pulled away with the girl giving chase and screaming probably well-deserved French profanity at her foul-mouthed customer. But no one was hurt, and everyone had a good time, and Greg presumably learned his lesson. The attempted assault merely added color to the evening, and to its subsequent rehashing, which in some ways was the most enjoyable part. To me, that 3-day break in Paris was not just necessary in terms of recharging our batteries, it was one of the most enjoyable experiences I had in all my years in the business. There is nothing like Paris. Of course, especially in the springtime, the trees are in full bloom. The scene is flowing strong, and the lovely Parisian women are everywhere. And all this is presented against a backdrop of some of the world's most extravagant and beautiful architecture. There is nothing like it, and I was thrilled to see the band and crew apparently enjoying their time in Paris. Or so I thought until the following day when David knocked at my door. "We got a problem, Noel." "Oh yeah? What's bothering you, David?" He shook his head. "Ain't me, man. It's Edward." This seemed surprising to me, as Edward had been his usual laid-back self since we arrived in town. "Something wrong with Edward?" I asked. "I guess you could say that." He paused, sort of laughed a little under his breath. "He wants to go home. Like, now." "Say I was surprised would be an understatement." Edward had seemed perfectly happy in Paris. He had played his guts out, as usual, at the Mogador, and had since been enjoying the sights, sounds, and tastes of the city and its residents. And there was that photo at the base of the Eiffel Tower. I couldn't imagine what could possibly be wrong. So I walked down to Edward's room and knocked at the door. Some time passed before the door opened, and Edward stood before me. His eyes were red and cloudy. I presumed he was high. Maybe he was, but he had also been crying. "Everything okay, Ed?" I asked. He shook his head and began sobbing. Then he threw his arms around my neck and pulled me close, crying so hard that his body shook. "Edward, what's wrong?" I honestly expected him to tell me that something terrible had happened. A death in the family, perhaps, or at least a diagnosis of terminal illness. Perhaps the Jehovah's Witnesses had finally caught up with his mother. But it was nothing like that. The truth was simply that Edward had been overcome by a severe case of homesickness. "I want to go back to L.A., he said, his breath catching on every word. "I don't want to do this anymore." My initial inclination was to shout some sense into Edward. "Are you kidding me? Every aspiring guitar player in the world wants to trade places with you right now. You have the world by the balls, young man." Then I would have sent him to his room without dinner or groupies like a responsible road manager. Instead, I simply held him tight and let him cry. Eventually, the anxiety and sadness poured out of him. "David, that hole, he wants to be a big rock star." Well, yes, he does, I said, but that's kind of the point of this whole thing, isn't it? Edward drew a hand across his face, wiping away some of the tears and snot, and shook his head aggressively. No, not for me. I don't want to be a rock star. I hate this bull. I just want to go home and play jazz and funk. I just want to noodle around. Noodling is what Edward did during most of his free time. You'd walk into his hotel room and he'd be sitting there on the bed, guitar in hand, just sort of creating, letting inspiration guide his miraculous fingers. He did this when he was sober or stoned, happy or sad. I've truly never met a musician who seemed more attached to his instrument, and so on some level I understood what Edward was saying. It's possible he really was at his happiest when he was alone with his guitar. But I also knew that part of him enjoyed being a guitar god, desired by women and worshipped by young men. I mean, seriously, who wouldn't? Regardless, he had an obligation to Van Halen, to his bandmates, his record label, his fans, and to himself, for goodness sakes. Didn't he wonder, how big is Van Halen gonna be? I sure as did. But there was no sense in arguing the point with Edward. His sadness and isolation were legitimate. He was an unusually sensitive and introverted guy, and right now he was hurting. And I didn't doubt for a moment that he really did want to go home. So as we sat down and continued talking, I played the home card. Listen, Ed, you've always told me that you want to buy your parents a nice house in Pasadena. They live in a little home. It's nice, but it's small, and your mom and dad aren't all that happy there, right? Edward shrugged. Yeah, I guess. Well, the truth is you're not going to be able to get them a house this year, not when you're making $175 a night. He laughed. I could tell he was coming around. But I can promise you this. If things keep going the way they're going now and this band breaks the way I think it's going to break, you'll be able to buy them a new house. You can even buy your dad a boat. You can get them a new car. You'll be able to get them everything they've ever wanted. I paused, letting it sink in, and then asked, how does that sound? He smiled at me. Pretty good, actually. As I looked at him, I couldn't help but see him for the kid that he practically was. It was easy to get caught up in how explosive their live shows were, in how talented Eddie was, and forget how new to stardom he was. Because they had burst onto the scene, finely tuned from their years of playing together, they seemed so fully formed, and yet they were young on so many levels. Even David, who took to stardom in the music business most naturally. Having been around the block with other young bands a few times, I had seen naiveness like this before. The difference with Van Halen was that they actually had a shot at making it. But if they were going to survive, they were going to have to grow up fast. Perhaps no one embodied the discomfort that rapid fame brought more than Edward. He may have been the resident genius, but he had a lot to learn about the world. And while there were so many ways in which his complex upbringing had hardened him, there was still an innocence there that I recognized from past experiences with other artists. I also recognized how quickly it could fade away if given the right mixture of support and success. Look, Edward, you can't leave now. You won't just disappoint the people here and the band and the crew, but you'll also disappoint everybody back home. They're expecting you to come home a hero. Do you want to let them down? You want to explain to them that you're not interested in being a superstar and a millionaire? I know you're homesick, but you'll get over it. I promise. Edward took a deep breath. He looked out the window at the most beautiful city in the world, but he didn't say anything, so I did. Come on, Edward, I tried again. Life is good. He laughed. Yeah, okay. So I guess you could say I sort of talked Edward into becoming a superstar. What the hell? Somebody had to do it. Well, that's the end of Chapter 5. Merci beaucoup, Noel Monk. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 5 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.